more, as you're about to discover, is brought to us by my dear colleague, Will Stoutamire. Will is the Associate Professor of History here at UNK, where he directs our undergraduate public history minor, as well as directs our graduate program, our master's program in public history. He has a PhD with distinction from Arizona State University, and while at Arizona State, worked as a contract historian for the National Park Service on a wide variety of projects across the American Southwest, which you will see much evidence of today. Prior to joining the faculty at UNK, he was the director at the G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture on our campus for 5 years, and then thankfully returned to us after a sojourn in Georgia. His research interests include the history of early museums and preservation activities, as some of you have seen in previous presentations by Will, particularly in the American West, with a special emphasis on the role these efforts played in larger settler colonial projects. And so without further ado, Will.
All right, well, thank you, Nathan, for that introduction. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be learning about the history of one of the least known and most enigmatic figures, I would say, in the history of the American Southwest. This guy, Harry E. Two Guns Miller. Sometimes he went by Indian Miller, sometimes he went by Chief Crazy Thunder. He is someone I guarantee that most of you have not heard of, which you're not going to forget after the next hour or so. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit. By the way, this is where's my pointer? This is Harry down here in the bottom right. I'm going to start by giving you just a little bit of context for how I came across Harry Miller. So as Nathan said in my introduction, when I was a graduate student at Arizona State University, I worked on a variety of contract projects for the National Park Service. One of those projects involved a site that I talked about in previous brown bags, Walnut Canyon National Monument. This is the ranger cabin at Walnut Canyon National Monument in the early 1900s, where the custodian for the National Monument lived when the National Monument was being managed by the U.S. Forest Service in the 1920s. Miller shows up briefly in the history of Walnut Canyon. And in my dissertation and my report for the National Park Service, he gets about a paragraph or two of time, because I just did not simply have the time to go down the rabbit hole that is his life. He shows up here in May of 1924 in an issue of The Moccasin, which is a magazine that he published while he was living behind the ranger cabin at Walnut Canyon in an Apache-style wickiup, which he operated as a quote-unquote Indian museum, where you could see human skulls that he had unearthed, as well as pottery and other materials. And he was telling tourists at the National Monument, visitors along the old National Trails Highway, which went right past the National Monument, that he was a full-blood Apache. And most people believed that he was a full-blood Apache chief. Harold Colton, who's the founder of the Museum of Northern Arizona, who I've also talked about in previous brown bags, was not as taken in by Miller as others. This is Colton pictured here on the left, doing his best Colonel Sanders impression. And later in life, towards the end of his life, about 3 years before he died, he started doing research into Miller. He started contacting descendants of Miller's family. He started collecting newspaper clippings about Miller's life, and he wrote an unpublished sketch biography of Miller in which he says, what kind of an Indian he was, I am not sure. Some called him a half-breed. He called himself Apache and was reported a full-blood Apache, but he wore his hair in pigtails like a Taos or Plains Indian, blending indigenous styles here. He was thoroughly acculturated and well-educated. His wife, said to be half Mohawk, and daughter appeared to be Anglos, or white. It is rumored that he was adopted by whites and lived many years in India. Interesting figure. So we're going to talk about who the real Harry Miller is here for the purpose of this brown bag. And we're going to start by going all the way back to 1880, the year after he is born, when he shows up in the 1880 census as the 1-year-old son of William Henry Harrison Miller and Sarah Miller, living in Roswell, New Mexico. William Henry Harrison Miller, his father, is described in the census record as a farmer from Iowa, with family of one parent from Massachusetts and another from Tennessee. His mother, Sarah Miller, is keeping home and from Missouri, with both of her parents from Kentucky. The Apache didn't live in Kentucky. Harry is, of course, described simply as white, having been born in Roswell, New Mexico. So he has a mother from Missouri and a father from Iowa. First known photograph we have of Harry Miller comes from about 1890 when the family is still living in Roswell. And he's pictured here with all of his siblings as well as his parents. This is Harry here on the left at about 11 years of age. We can dig a little bit further into Harry's genealogy here by looking at the obituaries for both of his parents. We'll start with his father, pictured here with his lovely beard, William Henry Harrison Miller, who died in December of 1904, and whose obituary notes that he was born in Lee County, Iowa in 1842 and lived for a time in northeastern Missouri. That he served in the Civil War as a member of the 7th Missouri Cavalry, which is a Union cavalry regiment, and that after the Civil War, when he was discharged, he married Miss Sarah Rice. He goes on to note that at the time of his death, his son Harry is a first lieutenant in the U.S. Regulars, now doing constabulary duty in the Philippines. We're going to get to that for just a minute. His mother, Sarah, dies 5 years later, and here she is pictured on the right. And again, we see she was born in Missouri in 1840 and married to William Henry Harrison Miller. And the obituary goes on to say that she, with her husband and family, crossed the plains from Missouri to California by wagon train in an early day, and from there went to New Mexico in 1877. They were settlers, homesteaders. They came across in a wagon train on the Oregon Trail, the Overland Trail, settling actually initially in Colorado before moving down to New Mexico. By 1900 or so, they're living in Eugene, Oregon, and when Harry reaches adulthood, he enlists in the military to fight in the Spanish-American War, and specifically to go and fight, as was indicated by that first obituary, in the Philippines. So in about 1898, in May, just after the Spanish-American War begins, just a month after hostilities begin between the United States and Spain, Harry Miller is shown enlisting in Company M of the 2nd Oregon Volunteers. Company M of the 2nd Oregon Volunteers. He's enlisting in Portland, Oregon. He's going to go directly to the Philippines, where, like a lot of American service members who spent time in the Philippines, he spends most of his time sick. He's sick in June, he's sick in August, he's sick in October, and then he gets transferred to Company C of the 2nd Oregon U.S. Volunteers, where he is sick in November, sick in December, and sick from December through February 7th. He is sick through the end of the Spanish-American War and the beginning of what's known as the Philippine-American War, sometimes called the Philippine Insurrection, which happens with the Battle of Manila in February 4th and 5th of 1899. So he's actually in an infirmary in Manila when the fighting starts between the United States and Philippine, quote-unquote, insurrectionists who are seeking independence for the Philippines from U.S. rule. Okay. He's going to get mustered out, discharged, and returned to the United States just in time for the 1900 census, where we see his family living in Eugene, Oregon, his parents and 2 younger siblings, and where Harry shows up living just down the road in Florence, which is on the coast, just west of Eugene, as a lodger in a hotel owned by a guy named Daniel Stibbins, and working as a day laborer. But Harry apparently didn't like working as day laborer, and so he's going to re-enlist in the military, this time as a member of the 5th U.S. Infantry, Company I, beginning as a first sergeant. Eugene Guard, the local newspaper reporting here, Harry E. Miller, one of the members of Company C of the 2nd Oregon in the Philippines, who returned to the islands after the regiment came back to America, is now First Sergeant, Company I, 5th U.S. Infantry, doing service in the Philippines. He will spend the next 14 years of his life living in Luzon, in the North Island of the Philippines. He will muster out of Company I of the 5th U.S. Infantry fairly quickly. He'll be discharged honorably in 1903, 1904, and join the constabulary service, which is police service in the Philippines. Policing Filipinos who are fighting against the United States still and trying to seek independence from U.S. rule. Here he shows up in a report of the Insular Office or Insular Affairs as Second Lieutenant Harry E. Miller in charge of 25 men in the Lepanto-Bontoc region of the Philippines, which is again on Luzon in the North Island. It's during that time that he actually sees at least some fighting, although he doesn't participate as a combatant himself, and writes a report in the 5th Annual Report of the Philippine Commission, or that gets re-recorded in the 5th Annual Report of the Philippine Commission, on what he witnessed, which is a conflict between some Filipino members of the Bontoc region and Filipino members of the Nueva Vizcaya region, which is just to the south. So he's witness to combat between two different Filipino communities. By 1906, he leaves the constabulary service, he quits being a police officer, and he takes up coffee farming. Again, in the Bontoc region of the Philippines, among the Igorot people who live in that area. So here we have Mr. H.E. Miller, a former constabulary officer, is planting very extensively for himself at Pingad, and has contracted and is planting an extensive capital for another American in the same vicinity. This example has potential, and it is safe to estimate that 100,000 young trees will be planted this season. Now, up until this point, Harry Miller's life is a pretty traditional story of a young white man from the United States signing up to fight in the Philippines, signing up to fight during the Spanish-American War, staying behind, working in the police service, and then starting a business, a coffee plantation in the Philippines. This happens all the time, but this is where things start to derivate a little bit. As I mentioned, he's going to live in Luzon until 1914. Among the Igorot people in the Bontoc region, which is this area right here. Manila is down here, to give you a sense. The very northern island of the Philippines. And while there, he's going to marry a Filipino woman by the name of Agunay. Sometimes she's referred to as Ina. And with his wife Agunay, he will have ultimately 4 children. May, his eldest, who is born in 1909. Lula, born in 1912. Kentis, born in 1913, and South Bend, born after they returned to the States in 1918. And can anybody guess where South Bend was born? South Bend, Indiana. This is the only known photograph we have of his wife, Agunay, and his youngest 3 children. So these are Lula and Kentis, and then South Bend. This is in a passport photo that they took in 1920 while living in the United States. So he is a white man with a Filipino wife and 4 half-Filipino children. Now, to understand what happens next, we need a little bit of context for a phenomenon of the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States that has long since fallen out of favor. And that's the use of human zoos as a form of entertainment. Okay? In the late 1800s and early 1900s in the United States and in other colonial powers, it was very common for World's Fairs and expositions in places like Coney Island to host human zoos where people from colonial territories were placed on display for visitors to see, typically to reinforce the idea that these people were quote-unquote savage or barbaric or uncivilized. Okay? Coney Island here in 1905, the Brooklyn Times is reporting on the opening of several attractions, including one featuring this individual who is a member of the Igorot community of the Philippines, where Miller was living. And here we have a big broadside for the first Greater American Colonial Exposition, which was held in Omaha in 1899, and featured, among others, a recreation of a castle from Havana celebrating the defeat of the Spanish in Cuba, and a Filipino village, complete with water buffalo, where you could go and see living Filipino human beings as exhibits, but then imported to the United States specifically to serve as exhibits. The fascination with Filipino people in particular focused on 2 things: headhunting and ritual dog eating. So these are reinforcing ideas that these people are less than those living in the United States and therefore need to and deserve to be colonized. So Harry Miller is aware of this phenomenon, but he's about 15 years too late. We're going to talk about that. When Miller decides to leave the Philippines, he decides that he is going to start his own human zoo, and that he wants to import Filipino Igorot people to the United States, specifically for the Panama Pacific Exposition, which is going to be held in San Francisco in 1914. So he boards a ship with about 12 to 14, the numbers vary, 12 to 14 members of the Igorot community, amongst whom he had lived for over a decade, and he brings them to the United States. They stop over briefly in Hawaii, where the Honolulu Star Advertiser runs a story on this, and where for the very first time we see Henry Miller describing himself as Indian Miller. He's finally adopted that moniker. He's been Harry Miller all along, now he is Harry E. Indian Miller. We have a headline, "Headhunters from wilds of Philippines invade Honolulu, bound for capital to do politics and oppose home rule. Members of the delegation of 14 Igorot headhunters are en route to the national capital." Accompanying is a portrait of Henry Miller, in charge of the expedition. We get a sense of his purpose from this article as well. I'm just going to highlight one short passage where it says, "Direct from the wilds of northern Luzon, 14 Igorots, members of the fiercely savage section of the Philippine population," again reinforcing the idea that Filipinos are quote-unquote barbaric and savage, "known as headhunters, arrived at Honolulu yesterday on the steamer Tenyo Maru, en route to the mainland on a double mission. First, according to their guardian manager, H.E. Indian Miller, to exhibit themselves to their white fellow countrymen, to be a human zoo. And second, to do a little political headhunting in the national capital. Their pilgrimage to Washington, as outlined by Mr. Miller, will include a call on President Woodrow Wilson, to whom they wish to present a protest against the granting of Philippine independence." So he is using these people to advocate against giving the Philippines independence, and there is actually a bill called the Jones Bill in Congress at this time that is considering the possibility of giving the Philippines independence from the United States. He is bringing these people to the United States to demonstrate that the Filipino people are not, quote unquote, civilized enough to be independent. And the steam records, or the passenger list, I should say, for the steamship Tenyo Maru verifies some of these claims. We have Harry E. Miller here, arriving in May of 1914 on the Tenyo Maru as a second-class passenger. He is listed as a planter because he was a coffee farmer, right? And he is described as headed to Washington, D.C. He is accompanied by his eldest, May, who is at that point almost 5 years old. So only one of his children accompanies him. His wife and other children are behind in the Philippines. This is a picture of the steamship that they came over on. And in steerage, we have a passenger list for the Bontoc Igorot people who came with him. The 12 individuals who were on the ship, 8 men, 4 women, all from the Bontoc region of the Philippines, who are going to be exhibited in this human zoo. And then things go awry. Actually, things go awry before he even gets off the ship, because Miller gets arrested. Miller gets arrested before he's even able to get off the Tenyo Maru by U.S. Marshals on charges of kidnapping. Of kidnapping the Bontoc people who he brought with him to the United States. And this is headline news across the country. It's headline news in the San Francisco Bulletin, which reports that the exploiter of Filipino girls is under arrest. Harry alias Indian Miller, a showman, is under arrest for transporting Filipino women. The San Francisco Chronicle reports a promoter jailed as kidnapper H.E. Miller, arrested by U.S. Marshal on warrant cabled from the Philippines, brings Igorots here. He accuses insular officials of interfering with his plans for political reasons. In the Salt Lake Herald, reporting exhibitor charged with abduction of Igorot minors. Indian Miller arrested on arrival at San Francisco from the Orient. What he is explicitly charged with is violating a penal code of the Philippines, Penal Code 486, which forbids someone from taking minors above the age of 7 out of the Philippines without their parents' consent. Okay? And basically what ends up happening is that after he leaves the Philippines, the Filipino government wires the U.S. government to warn the United States that he is coming and that he has, in their mind, kidnapped some Filipino people, which is why the U.S. Marshal is waiting to arrest him. This goes to trial. This is one of the girls that he brought over. This goes to trial, and we get more details as to what he was doing. And while he may not have been a kidnapper, he was at minimum engaged in human smuggling and acknowledges that fact. He tells the newspaper, based on the reports coming out of the trial, that in spite of fierce opposition by the local authorities to the undertaking, Miller and his business associate Unfanger succeeded in organizing a party of Bontocs on the outskirts of the village at night and escorted them to Manila. After many encounters, ruses, feints, and avoidance of outposts, Miller succeeded in reaching Manila at night and in hiding his party in a place convenient to the waterfront. There, he succeeded in secretly equipping the Igorots for the voyage to the United States, and in spite of the police force, Secret Service, customs officers, and other civil employees acting under orders of the authorities, succeeded in smuggling his party 3 at a time aboard the fastest launch procurable. The party boarded the British steamer Taming for Hong Kong a few minutes before it was to sail, and the authorities then had subpoenas served on the Igorots and attempted to remove them from that authority, but Miller called their hand, confiscated the subpoenas, and refused to go ashore with the party, violating law here in the Philippines. In Hong Kong, Miller would claim 2 assassins came after him, supposedly sent by the Filipino government. I'm not sure I buy that particular part of this story. And then, while in Hong Kong, in order to mislead government agents there, Miller announced that the party would sail to New York via the Suez Canal, and then quietly boarded the Japanese steamer Tenyo Maru for San Francisco. So he is admittedly evading Filipino authorities and trying to evade American authorities as well to bring these dozen Igorot people into the United States. He will, as I kind of alluded to a minute ago, have his charges dropped because all of the individuals he brings over are adults. They're not minors. His charges are dropped. And this is some of the individuals performing a year later, as reported by the Red Bluff, Mahama County Daily News. So he will set up his human zoo, but he won't do it at the Panama Pacific Exposition as he had intended. He will do it on his own and in partnership with some local carnivals. And we see, again here, kind of repeated refrains of the stereotypes about Filipino peoples that human zoos reinforce. So the Venice, California Evening Vanguard here reporting as the Igorots come to town, chain your dogs or the Igorots will get them. Right? If you do not want your high pedigreed family pet to become a meal for the Igorots when they come, well, you better keep him where the advance guard of these savages cannot get him, reinforcing these racial stereotypes about Filipinos. Doggone it, they must eat. Or Harry Miller goes to a local pound owner and tries to purchase a dozen dogs for the Filipinos to eat for white audiences. And then advertising again in the Evening Vanguard, where one of the individuals that Miller brought over is portrayed passing a note to a city clerk in Venice asking to be appointed as the local dog catcher. Really beating in these racial stereotypes about Filipino peoples. Now you may be asking, what about the rest of his family? Who is Filipino? Who are Igorots? They come over a couple years later in 1916. Miller returns to the Philippines and boards the Toyo Kisin-Kayasha with his wife, Agunay, and 2 other children, Quintus, and Lulu. And shortly after arriving in the United States, Agunay is going to give birth to that 4th child, South Bend, in 1918. And then sometime very shortly after that, either in 1918, 1919, or the early part of 1920, Miller abandons his Filipino family with the exception of May, the daughter he came over with initially. They kind of disappear for the most part from the historical record, except here. In 1924, when Agunay, Quintus, Lulu, and South Bend all show up in the Lafayette, Indiana Journal and Courier as members of a traveling carnival circus. They themselves become Igorot Human Zoo performers. Harry goes off on his own and starts derivating into other things and starts selling himself rather than other people to make money. And he first is going to do that in El Paso, Texas, where he starts dabbling a little bit in the history of the American Southwest. And particularly, he shows an interest in the history of the Spanish Southwest. He publishes an article in the El Paso Herald called "Discovering Arizona Was No Easy Task," a story of a friar, a Negro, and a dog, which is a story of Fray Francisco Marcos and the Coronado expedition in the 1500s. And he takes people on tours of local cliff dwellings. Ancestral Pobloan cliff dwellings in New Mexico, here taking C.B. Wilson of the International Engraving Company on a tour of northern New Mexico to explore the cliff-dwelling sites there, where now he's starting to embellish his resume even more, saying that he's a graduate of Carlisle Indian Industrial School, one of the most famous Indian boarding schools in the United States. He is, again, not native. Cannot reinforce that enough. He did not go to Carlisle. That is a lie. He's going to continue the shtick as a historian when he moves to San Diego in 1920. You can see him pictured here in his now adopted attire. Long braided hair, in Plains Indian dress, or even a long headdress. Okay? So here we have the San Diego Union reporting full-blooded Apache Indian, soldier of fortune, wanderer, historian arrives in San Diego to finish gathering material for story of the Great Southwest. He's telling the local papers in San Diego that he's going to write a history of California and a history of the American Southwest, and he's leveraging his fake identity as a Native American to bolster these claims, to add interest to these claims. He says here, it's hard to read, I understand, he says, Miller has lived the life of an Apache boy of the old days. No, he did not. We know that, right? Full-blooded American Indian to give interesting facts on the origin of the word California is the headline for this particular article, where Miller says that he is the discoverer of the origin of the word California. It's a grand claim. It's not the first time he's going to say that he discovered something. He becomes a lecturer, going on the public circuit, lecturing about history and indigenous culture, and specifically lecturing about Apache culture. Again, he's not Apache, but he's telling people that he is, and then he's using that to get hired to be a lecturer to talk about Apache history and Native American history. Right? So here he's addressing the local ad club in San Diego. Indian Miller, also known as Crazy Thunder, will address the members on the blind prophet, an old Indian legend. Not native. He goes to schools and educates children, again, using his fake identity. Here he's addressing pupils of the Allison School in La Mesa, where he's expected to bring to his audience a greater knowledge of the ideals and customs of the Indian people. Not native. And he becomes a performer while in San Diego. He plays the role of Massasoit Atsamiquan, the Wampanoag leader who met with the Pilgrims in 1620 in a tercentenary 300th anniversary pageant held in San Diego. And he plays the role of Alessandro, an indigenous character in the story of Ramona, which was a popular fictional story from that time. And this is, again, Miller's portrait in his headdress. And then it starts to get real weird. I think you thought it was weird, right? It's just getting worse. He becomes a tire salesman, where he joins forces with Savage Tires, which is an automobile tie manufacturer. Indian Miller, a full-blooded Apache Indian and an authority on the history of the Southwest and the legends of his people, has joined the advertising department of the Spreckles Savage Tire Company in San Diego, referring to his days of his boyhood in the tribe of the Aravaipa Apaches. These are all lies that he is using to gain for material gain. Here we see Miller pictured next to several girls who were hired to work with the quote-unquote Savage Tire Company at a factory that's opening, and an article written by Crazy Thunder, by Indian Miller, where he says of this visit, quote, they were met at the office doors by Indian Miller, alias Crazy Thunder, a full-blooded Apache who has adopted the company. He takes great pride in the factory, which after a characteristic investigation, he decided merits its reputation and is a worthy namesake of the Indian people. Reinforcing stereotypes again now about indigenous people, that he is not a member of. He then runs an ad campaign in partnership with Savage Tires. And so they publish ads in the newspapers in San Diego and actually across the country advertising this company's tire product, where Indian Miller writes a little historical blurb, contributes a drawing, and is contributing to what is known as the History of the Red Man series. There are about 15, 16 odd issues of this particular advertising campaign. He always finds a way to spin his little local history into selling these automobile tires. So here in talking about the quote-unquote discovery of America by Columbus, he ends by saying the day of discovery is not over. Motorists are discovering in savage tires a product in keeping with the ideal behind their manufacture. And in here, talking about the campaigns of Geronimo, he ends by saying, as the Indians of old were superior on the bad trails because he trained to endure, so savage tires are superior on the bad trails today, for they are built to excel. Again, leveraging a fake identity for personal gain. And it's at this point that he finally shows up at Walnut Canyon. 1922, he moves to Flagstaff, Arizona, and sets up his wiki up behind the ranger cabin at Walnut Canyon that I started this talk with. And he begins to interpret the history of the cliff dwellings for visitors, claiming again that because he is quote-unquote Apache, he has special knowledge that he can share with tourists. He starts publishing The Moccasin, a semi-monthly magazine of which there are only 2 extant issues, volumes 1 and 2, in 1924, where he writes at great length about his theories on the history behind the cliff dwellings of Walnut Canyon National Monument. He collects, as I mentioned before, pottery and human remains from the cliff dwellings and then puts them on display at his quote-unquote Indian Museum behind the ranger cabin at Walnut Canyon. And he starts providing a series of lectures to tourists and local residents. Daily lectures at the Walnut Canyon cliff dwellings on a variety of topics, from the pottery of the cliff dwellers to their architecture to the wisdom of the cliff dwellers. It's around this time that he gets married again as well. And he's going to marry a woman named Margaret, who is from Massachusetts and New York, and who is going to start passing herself off, despite the fact that she's also not native, as a mixed blood Mohawk. And we can see here in the 1930 census, Harry really leaning into the lie by claiming that he is full-blood Apache in the official census records of the United States government. He's also going to start passing off his daughter, who is still with him, Meg, pictured here on the left, as a full-blood Sioux. We're just all over the place. If you're confused, I'm confused, that's the way this goes. Okay? He only stays at Walnut Canyon, though, for a couple years. He moves on from there for reasons that are not entirely clear, and he moves a little further east along the National Old Trails Highway, which is eventually going to become Route 66, to a place called Canyon Diablo, which is in northeastern Arizona. A place called Canyon Lodge as well, and a place that eventually becomes known as Two Guns, which is the moniker that he's going to take for himself down the road. Coconino Sun, the Flagstaff newspaper, announced in 1925 that Indian Miller has an interesting and much larger museum at Canyon Diablo than at the cliff dwellings. He builds a fake cliff dwelling. He establishes a curio shop. And he establishes a zoo, which we'll talk about in just a second. He continues to collect southwestern archaeological materials, including human remains, finding a skeleton of an early cliff dweller and other human bones, which he puts on display in his museum in Canyon Diablo. And as I mentioned, he becomes a zoo owner at this point. He had dabbled in zoo ownership a little bit when he was living in Walnut Canyon. He had some horned frogs and a Gila monster, but this really takes off when he's living in Canyon Diablo. He starts putting ads in the local newspapers asking trappers to provide him with animals to put on display for tourists. We'll buy baby mountain lion, bobcats, foxes, and antelopes at Rest Indian Miller Canyon Lodge, Arizona. He takes photographs with his captured wildlife. Here he is shown wrestling with a mountain lion in 1924. And occasionally, as all good zoo owners do, he gets bitten by his wildlife. Indian Miller pays Phoenix visit, recalls story of pet Gila monster, shown here, which became angered and bit him. And then he becomes a murderer. There's a term. When in 1926, in March of 1926, he is accused of murdering his neighbor, a guy by the name of Elmer Cundiff. So here we have Charles Indian Miller, Apache Indian chief, who conducts a desert zoo and curio shop at Canyon Lodge, shot and killed Elmer Cundiff, storekeeper at the lodge. He turns himself in, and he gets out eventually on bail for an enormous sum, which I think gives some light into the amount of wealth he gathered by faking this identity. $20,000 in bail is the bail that is set for his murder of Elmer Cundiff. About $350,000 today, which he pays and then promises the local sheriff that he'll come back every night to spend the night in jail if he can just go work at his zoo during the day. That's the deal he strikes. He will be acquitted for this murder. He does kill Elmer Cundiff, that's not disputed, but he will be acquitted for this murder on self-defense, claiming that Cundiff had threatened his life and that he had to take a gun from Cundiff, and the only way to get away was to kill Cundiff in the process. Now, there are a number of speculations as to why Miller and Cundiff got into an argument. The official story is that Cundiff was mad at Miller for something involving the property that Miller was leasing from him. The zoo was leased from Elmer Cundiff. The newspapers provide some other potential avenues for analysis here. Just a week before the murder, the Flagstaff Coconino Sun runs a story saying Indian artist Miller's wife and cash gone, and noting that it was learned that she had E.M. Cundiff, merchant at Canyon Lodge, take her to Winslow, from which she took a train to Rochester, New York, where his brother lives. So allegedly, Cundiff maybe helped his wife abscond with some of his money. She returns like a week later, so it's a little unclear. The family has their own story as well, and this comes from a letter that was sent to the museum in Northern Arizona in the 1980s by a great niece of Harry Miller, who says that, quote, "My family history recounts how Harry may have been involved with Earl Cundiff's wife." So that's a possibility as well. Now, as every good acquitted murderer does, the first thing Harry does after he is acquitted for his crime is take out an ad in the local newspaper thanking all the local residents. "Thanks, all of you. Your esteemed paper has been so fair toward me before and during my trial, and the people of Flagstaff, including my bondsmen, have been so staunch that I feel it is fitting for me to take this way of expressing my heartfelt appreciation and thanks, in which I am joined by my wife, now returned, and daughter." And then, as every good murderer does, you become a philosopher. And in 1929, Harry Miller publishes his one philosophical treatise called The Philosophy of Universality, which is actually printed by the Coconino Sun in Flagstaff, and which I do not remotely have the time to get into today, nor the aspirin necessary to read. It is wild. It's about a 35-page philosophical text. Okay. Now, at this point, Miller can't live in Two Guns, Arizona either. He's killed his neighbor. His kind of reputation is a little bit in tatters there. So he moves yet again, and this time even further east, down what becomes Route 66 to the community of Lupton, Arizona, which is on the state line with New Mexico, just west of Gallup. And if you thought things were weird now, they're going to get worse. When he first arrives in Gallup in 1930, 1931, he stumbles across a series of Puebloan sites. Genuine, authentic, ancestral Puebloan dwellings. These are discovered by Harry Miller, and he calls on Dr. Byron Cummings of the Arizona State Museum and on Lyndon Hargrave of the Museum of Northern Arizona to come and review the dwellings that he has found. And they determined that these dwellings are some 9 centuries old, and maybe the finest example of an ancient Pueblo city immediately accessible to the motor tourist. So what do? If you're Harry Miller? You set up a tourist shop right next to the cliff dwellings. So he sets up a tourist shop, and he moves in with his wife to a nearby cave where he builds a fake cliff dwelling in which he lives and continues his business enterprise. Gallup Independent reports in 1940 of the spectacle that he had built called the Seven Devils Cliff Dwelling, sometimes Seven Devils and Seven Angels, which it describes as looking like a Walt Disney colored picture, but really the result of work done by Indian Miller over the last 12 years. And he operates a zoo from the Cave of the Seven Dwellings, because here's the Cave of the Seven Devils, because he can't give that up, placing yet again ads in the local newspapers asking for local trappers and residents to help him out. This one is asking for a female dog with puppies to help him nurse a baby mountain lion. I'm I'm not a scientist, I don't know how that works, but that's what he's asking for. Female dog with puppies to nurse baby mountain lions. And again, because he's a zoo owner, he also gets bitten by the mountain lion. He actually spent some time in the Gallup hospitals having been attacked by the mountain lion that he owned at his zoo. He becomes a poet in the 1940s, publishing eventually 35 issues of this collection called Songs of the Navajo Sea, of which I unfortunately have all 35 copies. You can see some of his poetry here from the very first issue with his characteristic style of drawing that showed up in those Savage Tire advertisements in 1920. Right? But he doesn't use the Songs of the Navajo Sea primarily for poetry. He does for the very first issue. The rest of it's prophecy. By the second issue of Songs of the Navajo Sea, Miller, who's pictured here sitting in his cave, Cave of the Seven Devils, having grown his prophetic beard, declares himself a true prophet of the Lord. And he starts publishing prophecy in the Songs of the Navajo Sea, claiming in particular that what the Lord has revealed to him is two miraculous and supernatural discoveries: the rediscovery of the famous lost kingdom of Cibola, and the rediscovery of the Garden of Eden. So he's going to rediscover the American Southwest, building on his long fascination in Southwestern history, but with a really bizarre twist. His biggest claim by far is his claim to have rediscovered the 7 cities of Cibola, which are cities that Coronado was looking for in 1540, cities that supposedly were filled with gold. Cities that archaeologists and historians today believe to be some of the pueblos of New Mexico, like Zuni and Acoma and Hawiku, which is a ruin that you can go visit. Miller is going to dispute that interpretation and say instead that Cibola is located in Lupton, where his tourist stop is. He's going to produce a map that is reprinted multiple times throughout Songs of the Navajo Sea, showing the location of all 7 of the cities of Cibola, all entirely, and I'm sure totally coincidentally, located within a few miles of his tourist attraction in Lupton. He's going to start claiming that archaeologists and historians are wrong about everything in early American Southwestern history, the early Spanish Southwest, I should say. Gallup Independent in 1946 reporting that Two Guns Miller claims he's found the true Acoma, which would be a surprise to the people of Acoma who have lived in Acoma for over 1,000 years. In January, he claims to have discovered the true El Morro, which would be a surprise to the National Park Service, which had been operating El Morro as a national monument since 1906, and where you can go and see Spanish inscriptions that date back hundreds of years. All of this is based on faulty reading of old Spanish maps and his translations of Spanish documents. He disputes the translations that are the official accounts. Just give you one glimpse into his mindset here, one of the claims he makes is that if you take these old Spanish maps, which I will note are not topographic maps and are not geographically accurate to the mile, but he is treating like they are, and if you properly orient them with the top of the map to the west, as was a general custom of that date, which it was not, you get the 7 cities of Cibola located in Lupton. In fact, what you get is this map, which he reproduced in his Songs of the Navajo Sea, showing the quote-unquote fake route, the route that archaeologists and historians believe Coronado took, through past Zuni, through El Morro, through Acoma, and through Laguna, which he calls the fake El Morro, the fake Acoma, the fake Laguna, and you get the true route, which is very condensed and all right around Lupton, Arizona. Here's the real El Morro, according to him, the real Acoma, according to him. He needs to find some support for this, and along the way, he ends up partnering or at least getting some support from another strange figure who I simply just do not have time to go into today, and that is an individual by the name of Natoni Nesba, who claims to be a full-blooded Navajo archaeologist, and who will support some of his claims that the Spanish were in Lupton. But Nesba is a questionable figure as well. He doesn't show up in the historical record at all until 1937, when under the name Maurice Berry, he and his wife claimed to be able to translate a petroglyph panel in near Idaho Falls, Idaho, where he is living at that time. And he claims, one version of this, that his Navajo grandfather taught him how to read petroglyphs, which is not a thing, and that this particular petroglyph panel tells the story of a outcast band of Puebloan, Aztec, and Toltec people fleeing across Idaho. If you know anything about geography, the Aztecs are not anywhere near Idaho. Near the Toltecs. He makes lots of claims in newspapers, none of which can be verified, and which I thought I'd just reproduce here for simplicity's sake. He claims to have been educated at Carlisle and Haskell, the two most famous Indian boarding schools in the United States, where he claims to have received a BA in language, an MD in scientific research, and a PhD in archaeology. These institutions do not grant graduate degrees. He claims to have worked for all 5 of the most famous archaeological organizations in the United States in this time, including the American Museum of Natural History, Chicago's Field Museum, the Carnegie Institute, the Smithsonian, and the Peabody Institute of Archaeology. Claims to have spent 15 years among a group of quote-unquote white Indians in Mexico who retain their histories on golden tablets. Claims to be fluent in 7 European languages and 14 indigenous languages, and claims to be the Navajo tribal historian and member of Navajo Tribal Council. I have tried to verify all of this, and nobody has any record of this guy. And I think one of the records in the Southwest Museum of the American Indian had a file on the Tony Nesbaugh where the librarian and archivist added a little color note to the file folder describing him fairly well. Either a charlatan or an ignoramus. That's the description that the archivist for the Southwest Museum of the American Indian led for the Tony Nesbaugh. So Miller is gonna have to try to find a real archaeologist to support his claims that Cibola is in Lupton. And one of the individuals he reaches out to is Harold Colton. He sends Colton a series of letters, basically every other day, doesn't even give Colton a chance to respond. Sends him a series of letters in June of 1946, asking him to help come here and straighten matters out, and telling Colton that I would like to see you become, and he's got a great turn of phrase here, the new daddy of Southwestern archaeology. For I believe it will be a new baby. Colton responds to him saying that you have presented an interesting problem, but it is one that cannot be settled by simple inspection. By this point, Miller is convinced that it's Cibola. And Colton's writing back saying, it's going to take some time. And says, at the present time, I do not have time to make such a survey, as it would take several months. Miller reaches out to other archaeologists, to Emil Horry, who's at the Arizona State Museum, who tells him he doesn't have time. To Jesse Nussbaum with the National Park Service, who tells him he's full of it and it's not true. And eventually, as Harold Colton says in his sketch biography, Miller acquires a persecution complex. He becomes convinced that his prophetic revelations are not being reinforced by archaeologists and that all archaeologists are out to get him. This is a great picture of Miller getting ready to feed his baby ducks. He starts sending copies of his Songs of the Navajo Sea, as well as his 1-page or 2-page archaeological bulletins, to all of the archaeologists in the American Southwest. To Harold Colton, to Emil Horry, to Frederick Hodge at the Southwest Museum of the American Indian, to Jesse Nussbaum, to others. And sometimes he includes in those mailings, they're not asking for them, he is sending this stuff to them without it being requested. Sometimes he includes little notes for the individual that he sends that particular issue to. And it's revealing into the mindset, the descending mindset that is Indian Miller at this point. I regret, this is from an issue of the Songs of the Navajo Sea that he sent to Colton, saying, I regret that you will be embarrassed by the revelation, which I shall make shortly. You could have modified your system voluntarily. Starts getting threatening. I hope you may enjoy the respite I shall now give you. It has been a great pleasure to give you a good licking. That is the way I like to treat my friends. And now I apologize for my past rudeness. Stop in to see me. In his bulletins, which accompany the Songs of the Navajo Sea, he starts publishing diatribes about Southwestern archaeologists, saying here, my discoveries have been universally ignored. It's not a single one of these scientists has either denied or admitted them publicly, although my investigations have now continued for 8 months. In another issue, he says that he won't allow his findings to be concealed again by what he calls swivel chair historians and archaeologists. In another issue, he says, with my discoveries briefly described therein, now revealed that old bogus route, which never did have a leg to stand on, becomes intolerably absurd. I will not ascribe these most extraordinary errors of the past to deliberate hoaxes or frauds, but probably to inexcusable incompetence and stupidity. Was it because the National Park Service has based its institution upon this bogus and fraudulent Coronado route established by Bandelier, applying historic names to bogus places to bolster up a bogus system, that archaeologists of that service have ignored the information I have given them? I would prefer not to believe this, but I shall plant the seeds of truth in their front yards nevertheless. The archaeologist he probably fights with the most is Frederick Webb Hodge, who's the director of the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in California, which is now part of the Autry Museum. Hodge had a particular term for Miller that he would occasionally write on the things that Miller had sent him. Jitterbug. File with this jitterbug's other stuff and nonsense is the note he left on one of the songs of the Navajo Sea when he gave it to his secretary to file away. In one issue of the Songs of the Navajo Sea, Miller writes this: the map you reproduce on page 106 of Your History of Hawiku is evidently not a part of the Miro and Pacheco map of 1776. You have made a serious error there. I have that map, and it does not resemble the one you used. And Hodge just writes, jitterbug. Hodge only engages with Miller once, in 1951, when he writes Miller a note saying, after receiving the 35th issue of the Songs of the Navajo Sea, that, quote, I hope ultimately to receive some scientific or historical evidence in support of your theory that the so-called cities of Cibola were in the vicinity of Lupton. This would be more interesting than your name-calling of the defenseless dead. You never write a crazy person, because Miller writes him back an extremely long note saying that I've already published all my evidence and all the booklets that I've been sending to you, that I have not enjoyed hurting any of you gentlemen who were caught in the Bandelier booby trap. You gentlemen merely made the extremely serious mistake of being actively committed to a fraudulent system of early Southwestern history, and saying that with your experience through many years, you're now qualified to handle the reformation of your system. So fix it. Miller dies a couple months after, a couple months after writing that letter. The colorful career of Two Guns Miller ends, the Gallup Independent reports. Right? Describing him as a trader, an archaeologist, a writer, an animal trainer, and one of the most controversial figures in recent years in the American Southwest. And I think that's certainly true. There's very few remnants of Miller's life that you can see physically. If you go to Two Guns, Arizona, you can still see the remnants of the zoo that he built there as ruins off the side of the highway, now Interstate 40. If you go to Lupton, you can see a reborn version of his tourist track, Chief Yellow Horse Trading Post, owned by a Navajo family, the exact location where Miller lived and operated in Lupton and claimed the 7 cities of Cibola to be. That's kind of the end of this story, and it's a lot. But I think the big takeaway here for me is Miller being an important cautionary tale of the way that people historically have leveraged false claims of identity. Miller claimed to be Apache, and he very much so was not. And he leveraged those claims into speaking engagements, into writing opportunities, into opportunities to go into schools and share histories that he knew nothing about, into ad campaigns with a tire company, into publications, into archaeological claims, into a zoo and curio shop, and all sorts of things. He leveraged that fake identity for personal gain throughout most of his life and made significant profit off of that. He is an early example of what we would now call a pretendian, someone who is pretending to be indigenous but is in fact not, and is using that false claim of identity for personal gain. So I think there's a lot we can learn from looking at his life as an early example of the issue of pretendianism, which is something that continues through to the present day. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk. Just a thank note for the folks who I gathered materials from, and I will take any questions.
Do you know what happened to his family? Or that daughter daughter especially that came first.
I don't know what happens to the daughter after about the 1930s. Yeah. She wins a swimming championship at some point. She lives in California, wins a swimming championship. That's the one weird thing.
What about the first wife and those kids?
They just kind of disappear from the record.
I mean, this guy, I have so many questions. And I do want to say that it does make sense that a prophetic cult leader sort of vibe is the end goal, like the end of this story. But I guess, like, I was curious, just growing up in Oregon, you know, Warm Springs Reservation's about 30 minutes east of Eugene, and so I'm just sort of curious if you came across his Oregon time, like sort of connecting those dots early in his life or not.
Not really. He's so young. There's not much on him.
Yeah.
You know, he's a teenager, so there's really not much.